Cancel culture, woke culture, is out of control.
Cancel culture is real, it's insane, and it's growing exponentially.
This isn't about Confederate statues, it never was. It's about destroying our culture and our history.
You're vilified, you're targeted, your career's over.
You're seeing, in certain places, book burnings happen.
Aunt Jemima, Chris Pratt, Goya, Nick Sandman, George Washington, Gone with the Wind, the Muppets, the list goes on and on.
Defund Paw Patrol, fire and prosecute Chase, and euthanize the police dog.
Do you think President's Day is next on the list for cancel culture?
I feel like I am losing my fucking mind. Over the last 2 years, cancel culture has become as important to conservatives as gun control, racism, and Fleabag are to liberals.
I mean, they're demanding that you disavow your own ancestors, that you hate your own country.
And it's not just conservatives. Prominent Democrats have also started publicly worrying about a spirit of censoriousness taking over the left.
There is this sense sometimes of the way of me making change is to be as judgmental as possible about other people.
I am weirdly obsessed with this because I used to host a podcast dedicated to moral panics, the idea that America is under threat from a new, unique, and exotic evil. From violent video games to satanic daycares to strangers kidnapping kids in white vans, we've had a lot of these in America. They often accompany new technology or societal changes, and they almost always end up targeting minority groups.
One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many.
And they're absolutely going to ruin everything, these woke social justice warriors.
So far, most of the debate about cancel culture has focused on the question of whether it's real or fake. But I think that's the wrong question. Moral panics always draw on real anxieties and exaggerate real problems. That's what makes them effective. So I'm going to spend the rest of this video explaining why we should think about cancel culture as a straightforward moral panic, and why, if we're not careful, we're going to make the same mistakes we've made before. One of the surefire signs of a moral panic is when the same term gets applied to wildly different behavior. Cancel culture does actually have a dictionary definition, but the best encapsulation I've seen comes from Fox News. When individuals or groups are removed from platforms or lose their livelihoods because their opinions are deemed offensive. So we're talking about people who lose material economic benefits due to their political beliefs. The term's actually been around since the 1980s. It originated in a Chic song called Your Love Is Cancelled, which I could not find footage of, so here is footage of a different Chic song and the lyrics on the screen. It then pops up in 1991 in this scene in New Jack City.
Cancel that bitch. I'll buy it now.
After that, it sort of bounces around the culture. It shows up in a 50 Cent song in 2005, it shows up in a Lil Wayne song in 2010. In 2014, it pops up again in an episode of Love and Hip Hop New York.
You don't make me lie. You've been lying to me for 2 years. She's going like this in my face, yelling this with a high-ass, screechy voice, and I'm like, yo, what the are you talking about? Yo, get out my face.
I'm not going nowhere.
Get away from me.
I came all the way out here to be with you. I'm not going nowhere.
Get away from me. You canceled.
Canceled?
You
You got me up. I'm not going nowhere.
I was just watching New Jack City the night before.
So at this point, the term just meant removing your support from someone you know because they suck. But pretty soon, the definition of cancel started widening to all kinds of other things. First, it started showing up in activist campaigns. In 2014, the Colbert Report sent out this tweet, which I'm not going to read because it's super fucking racist. In response, a woman named Sui Park sent out this tweet with the hashtag #CancelColbert. She was talking about a TV show, so she meant it literally, but after that, the term cancel started being used online to refer to public figures and institutions who did racist, sexist, or otherwise problematic things. Over the next few years, the term became a mainstay of Black Twitter and started showing up in mainstream news sources. It also, importantly, started showing up in right-wing media.
You see the final expression of cancel culture in Islamist terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Conservatives started calling it cancel culture when college students protested a speaker or when a city took down a Confederate statue. By 2018, conservatives were using the term as a shorthand for any progressive demand they didn't like, regardless of whether it had anything to do with the original definition. And instead of pushing back, mainstream media sources mostly accepted the premise that cancel culture was a new, dangerous phenomenon that could refer to almost anything.
The stage is empty. There is no crowd. The silence speaks of not just COVID, but perhaps an even more contagious force: fear. Thanks to cancel culture.
To show you what I mean, here's a typical segment from a local news station.
Tonight, Denver 7's Russell Haythorne goes 360 on the rise of what's being referred to as cancel culture.
The segment starts off by referring to Bill Cosby, Kevin Spacey, and Harvey Weinstein as victims of cancel culture. It then cuts to some young people describing how they've had to cancel friends for having bad opinions.
I try to talk to them and explain why their behavior isn't cool before I just cancel them.
The segment ends with the example of Brian Williams, the NBC journalist who embellished a story about a visit to Afghanistan.
Stripped of his main anchor role at NBC and demoted to MSNBC.
So, in the space of roughly 4 minutes, you've got the same term, canceled, referring to famous people being convicted of rape, ordinary people ending a friendship, and a journalist being demoted for committing an ethical violation. Not only do these things have nothing to do with each other, but none of them even meet the Fox News definition of cancellation. Cutting a friend out of your life doesn't affect their livelihood, and none of the public figures here lost income due to their political views. This is how a lot of the media has spent the last few years, classifying completely random events as examples of the same thing. Here's a 2019 article from the New York Times about how teenagers are canceling each other. The opening anecdote is a girl who's in class and a boy starts playing an R. Kelly song. She asks him to stop because R. Kelly's a creep, and the boy refuses. She's had run-ins with him before and he's acted like a jerk, so she decides she's canceling him. She doesn't want to have a further relationship. The story also includes an anecdote about a girl who goes from middle school to high school and her old friends don't want to hang out with her anymore. The story tries to cast these things as related to accountability for public figures and people not being allowed to learn from their mistakes, but everything it's presenting is just ordinary human behavior. Sometimes you just don't want to be friends with someone. Sometimes kids are mean to each other. It's not useful to take a term we use for literal rapists and apply it to teenagers acting like teenagers. This is classic moral panic stuff. We already have terms for teenagers ostracizing each other, workers being fired from their jobs, and celebrities being criticized for their political views. The only reason to throw all these cases together is to make cancel culture seem like an all-encompassing national crisis. But nothing it's describing is new or exotic, and as soon as you start describing these things as what they actually are, they don't seem so threatening. Most moral panics rest on a collection of anecdotes that are either exaggerated or not true. During the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, Americans were told children across the country were being sacrificed by cults. During the Stranger Danger Panic of the 1990s, Americans were told millions of children were in danger of being abducted by strangers. Looking back, there was no basis for these fears other than a few isolated, extreme examples. This brings us to the Canceled Persons database. Ever since cancel culture emerged as a national issue, we've had a steady stream of anecdotes featuring celebrities, professors, and ordinary Americans facing consequences for their political views. The Canceled Persons database is an attempt to gather all these stories in one place. It's not clear who's behind it, but based on the site's About page and this little intro animation, it's very obviously making the case that cancel culture is a real societal problem. So let's dive in. The database is basically a list of people who've been canceled. Donald Trump is on there because he lost his Twitter account. So is a young adult author whose book was pulled from publication. There's also one of the Real Housewives of Orange County who lost a beverage endorsement after tweeting some light COVID denial. There's also a French professor who was beheaded after he showed a cartoon of Muhammad to his class. But what really stands out about this list isn't just the diversity of who these people are and what they did, it's that a lot of these stories don't hold up to scrutiny. Take Matthew Halls, a British orchestra conductor. According to the database, Halls was fired from the Oregon Bach Festival because he imitated a Southern accent while talking to a black friend. A white lady overheard and reported him to his employer for racial insensitivity. It's perfect fuel for the cancel culture war machine, right? You've got a white guy making a harmless joke. You've got his black friend who has said repeatedly in public that he wasn't actually offended by this statement, and yet Halls gets fired anyway. Basically, the minute this happens, it starts bouncing around the internet. It gets a bunch of write-ups in mainstream media outlets. But then, 2 months after the initial media frenzy, reporters at the Oregonian filed a public information request and got the internal documents describing why Halls was fired. Here's the headline. Whoops! It turns out Halls had 4 complaints against him for sexist and inappropriate behavior. The documents are heavily redacted, so we don't know the specifics of the complaints, but we know that at least one alleged that when Halls used to give feedback to female musicians, he would often talk about their looks and the way they dressed rather than how they played. The documents also showed that it's actually true that somebody did file a complaint against him for using this southern accent while talking to his black friend. The documents also show, however, that the board that decided to fire him really didn't take that complaint seriously. They basically looked at it and shrugged. So look, maybe you think Hall's alleged sexism rises to the level of a firing offense, and maybe you don't, but the fact is, this isn't a story of somebody who was fired for making a harmless joke. And I'm not just cherry-picking cases here. A huge percentage of cancel culture stories don't hold up under any scrutiny. That young adult author I mentioned whose book was pulled from publication, it wasn't pulled from publication. It was just delayed by 6 months, and then it was published and it sold super well. The database also includes a researcher named Susan Crockford, who was allegedly fired for publishing a study showing that polar bear populations are stable and aren't shrinking due to climate change. Sounds bad, right? Except, whoops, it turns out she was receiving payments from a climate denial think tank for years. Plus, she's never actually done any fieldwork on polar bears, and her work has been unanimously rejected by actual scholars in her field. She wasn't fired for politically incorrect research, she was fired for bad research. I'm not going to debunk every exaggerated entry in the database because we'd be here all day, but this is an extremely noticeable pattern in reporting on cancel culture. These stories make news when they happen, and then months later, once somebody actually investigates and puts all of the context and complication back into these stories, nobody notices. To this day, if you Google Matthew Halls, the vast majority of the stories you'll find are from the month after he got fired, saying that it was over this joke. There's only one story that includes any actual investigation, and you have to dig to find it. Even when cancel culture stories are true, they don't always matter. In the spring of 2019, a new school professor named Lori Scheck assigned her students a series of essays by James Baldwin. As part of the course, the class discussed a clip of Baldwin on the Dick Cavett Show in which he used the N-word. Scheck herself used the slur to contrast the original quote with the title of a documentary about Baldwin that came out in 2016. Soon after, she learned that one of her students had complained to the university that she was offended by the clip and that there was no reason for a white professor ever to use the slur. Scheck was forced to attend a meeting with the school's director of labor relations and investigated for racial discrimination and improper conduct. The case appeared in dozens of news outlets and was denounced by organizations dedicated to academic freedom. It even showed up anonymized in the infamous Harper's letter decrying a rising tide of censoriousness on the American left. As opposed to my previous examples, there's not much to debunk here. What's odd, though, is that this story doesn't meet any of the criteria for a cancellation. First of all, Scheck wasn't targeted by an internet mob. A single student filed a complaint against her. Second, she didn't face any consequences. The school spent a few weeks looking into the complaint, and then determined exactly what all the panicked internet takes had been saying all along. She hadn't violated any school policies. Looking back, I'm not sure anything actually went wrong here. Most universities have internal grievance mechanisms and an obligation to take every complaint seriously. Even if you think the student's complaint was utterly frivolous, this is how it's supposed to work. And, by the way, woke libs are not the only college students making frivolous complaints. The cancel culture panic is full of stories like this. Low-stakes cases that are true but aren't news. In March, Fox News had a 5-day meltdown over some obscure Dr. Seuss books no longer being published.
Dr. Seuss went from being a beloved childhood author to worse than Hitler in just a matter of days.
In April, Reason Magazine published a feature-length investigation into a random teacher at a random school who got a written warning because she disrupted a diversity training. In May, the right-wing press threw a tantrum over Princeton no longer requiring Greek and Latin for grad students in the classics department. And again, even if you think these cases are indefensible, there's no reason they need to be major national news stories. Most books eventually go out of print. Thousands of employees get warnings from their bosses for stupid shit every day. As for Princeton, unlike most of the journalists who wrote about this, I actually reached out to a professor to ask what was really going on with the changing degree requirements. He pointed out that students can still take Greek and Latin, they just aren't required anymore. A lot of other universities have already made the same change, mostly because Greek and Latin aren't available at the vast majority of public high schools. So requiring them gave an advantage to rich kids who went to wealthy prep schools. The changing degree requirements will affect, at most, 4 students per year. If parents don't like that, they can send their kids to another school. There's no reason this should have been a national news story in the first place. The problem becomes even clearer when you look at the cancellations of public figures. I don't know of a single famous person who's truly been canceled under the Fox News definition of the term. Have they lost gigs and been criticized for making racist, homophobic, or just baffling comments? Sure. And I actually agree that sometimes this criticism can be overblown. Social media really does act like a mob sometimes. But there's a mismatch here. For years now, pundits have compared cancel culture to some of the worst atrocities in history. They use terms like blacklist and witch hunt. Here's a New York Times columnist comparing cancel culture to the Rwandan genocide. Get a grip. The vast majority of these cases amount to highly esteemed millionaires becoming slightly less esteemed and, at worst, earning slightly fewer millions. Plus, let's not forget the public figures who did things that deserve criticism or consequences. None of this is new, and it's not a slippery slope to anywhere. Public figures have always been subject to backlash when they make controversial political statements.
Well, I'm gonna shoot them for what? How am I gonna shoot them? Them little poor little black people, little babies and children and women. How can I shoot them poor people? Just take me to jail.
Historically, most of these statements came from liberal celebrities, and the criticism came from conservatives. Even now, most organized efforts to ban books and restrict speech come from the right. Here's a list of the most banned books of 2019. Notice any themes? The only thing that's changed in the last few years is that now the loudest criticism is coming from people who want to change the status quo rather than defend it. The final sign of a moral panic is what it is used for. The stranger danger panic of the 1980s fueled mass incarceration. Fake stories of frivolous lawsuits in the 1990s inspired a wave of tort reforms that made it harder to sue corporations. The panic over political correctness in the 2000s helped justify budget cuts to higher education. The cancel culture panic is no different. After spending years whining about how college kids aren't exposed to challenging ideas anymore, Republicans spent most of 2021 banning challenging ideas.
The Western culture and values that brought forth Christianity in the founding documents are being called evil and racist.
I'm reminded of the tyranny of communist China.
There's no use looking for some high-minded philosophical principle to explain how conservatives switched from defending free speech to attacking it. They were mad about racist people getting fired, and now they're mad about teachers saying that racism is bad. All of their alleged concerns about censorship, indoctrination, open debate, it was all bullshit. The ostensibly liberal pundits wringing their hands about college students deplatforming speakers and celebrities getting roasted on Twitter are marks. Either they fell for a scam or they were in on it themselves. The fact is, there is no free speech crisis in America. As soon as you think about it for like 2 seconds, it's obvious that we live at a time of unprecedented freedom of expression. 50 years ago, if you had an idea you wanted to share, you could, tack it to a lamppost? Write a letter to the editor of your local paper? These days, you can post it on Medium, self-publish a book, form a Facebook group, start a newsletter, make a subreddit, become a YouTuber. These options are free, instant, and anonymous. It has literally never been easier in human history for ordinary people to disseminate controversial ideas. So why the hell are we always talking about a free speech crisis? Over the last 40 years, conservatives have turned the right to expression into a weapon against social change. The Supreme Court has ruled that corporations have a free speech right to meddle in elections. The Boy Scouts have a free speech right to fire a gay scoutmaster. Tobacco companies have a free speech right to advertise near schools. This has become one of the core tactics of the American right, whether they're promoting transphobia or questioning vaccines or hinting that the 2020 election was stolen. Rather than defending their ideas on the merits, they make procedural gripes about how you can't even ask questions in America anymore.
And these are the people who literally couldn't care less about the First Amendment, or any amendment, or in fact, any document that might limit their power in any way. They consider themselves gods, and they'd like you to shut up and obey, and they'll use force if they have to.
Meanwhile, at the same time conservatives have been whining about their own free expression, they've taken concrete steps to restrict the expression of everyone else. Since 2016, Republicans in 34 states have introduced or adopted legislation to criminalize political protests. Minnesota tried to ban protesters from holding public office or receiving student loans. Oklahoma made it legal to run over protesters with your car. Nassau, Long Island tried to allow police officers to sue protesters for financial damages. And that's just one form of speech. In New Hampshire, GOP legislators are trying to make it illegal for teachers to give a negative account of the founding of America. Iowa wants to ban the 1619 Project. 4 states already have laws that ban positive portrayals of homosexuality in public schools. Another 22 are trying to ban so-called critical race theory, a term so vague that it could prohibit reading Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech out loud in classrooms. Even if you think that cancel culture really is a nationwide problem, I don't see why we should focus on random college students and salty Twitter users rather than elected officials and actual legislation. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend there haven't been genuinely ugly internet pile-ons. Social media makes it easy to gang up on random people and ruin their lives over dumb jokes and honest mistakes. But for 2 years now, right-wing grifters and the liberal rubes who launder them into the mainstream have cast cancel culture as a problem for the American left and a sign of creeping authoritarianism.
We are in the process of really losing our sense of humor as a society.
They're wrong. Internet mobs are not a left-wing phenomenon, and historically speaking, the threat of authoritarianism usually comes from political parties that try to overturn elections, make it harder to vote, and censor ideas they don't like. All of this is obvious, but that's what moral panics do. They distract you from an obvious truth and make you believe in a stupid lie.